Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're tackling decisions, but with a twist. We're going global to see how different cultures approach making those big choices.
Sounds fascinating. Decisions are at the heart of, well, pretty much everything we do.
Exactly. And this article we've got is really practical. It points out how much our culture, the one we grow up in, shapes how we decide things.
I can see that being a blind spot for a lot of folks. Like, we think we're logical, but there's a whole cultural layer underneath.
Totally. So the article kicks off talking about two main styles of decision making. Consensual, where everybody gets a say.
So like more collaborative.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's top-down. Think military operations where speed is key.
Got it. So one's more about getting everyone on board, and the other's about, like, clear command, making the call, and moving on.
You got it. And they use these awesome examples to show how deep this goes. Like in Japan, there's this ringi system. Decisions kind of bubble up from the team.
Interesting. So it's not just the boss saying, do this.
Nope, it's way more about getting input from all levels. And that reflects a lot about Japanese culture, right? That emphasis on harmony, everyone working together.
Makes sense. So where does that put the U.S. on this spectrum? With our military example.
Well, the U.S., we tend to land more on that top-down side. Individual leadership, efficiency, getting things done fast, that's off of the priority.
So you're telling me if I'm working on a global team, just knowing what decision to make isn't enough? I got to figure out how each culture wants to get there.
Bingo. That's where things get tricky, but also super interesting. And that's why this article brings up Aaron Meyer's culture map.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Isn't it like a tool for understanding how cultures differ in, like, communication and stuff?
Yeah, exactly. And it has this deciding scale that's particularly helpful here. It literally maps out where countries fall in that spectrum, from total consensus to very top down.
So I could, like, look up where my colleagues' countries are and get a sense of how they might approach decisions?
You got it. And that can be a game changer for anticipating problems before they even happen. Like avoiding misunderstandings or clashes in how you work together.
That's brilliant. Because, like, if you're coming from a top-down culture and you're thrown into a team that's all about consensus, you'd be like a bull in a china shop.
Oh, totally. You'd be wondering why things are moving so slow. And on the flip side, if you're used to consensus and suddenly you're in a top-down environment.
He feels steamrolled, right? Like your opinion doesn't even matter.
Exactly. It's all about expectations.
Yeah.
And the culture map gives you a framework to figure those out beforehand. So we see Japan, they're way over on the consensus side, as we'd expect.
Makes sense. What about some other examples?
The Netherlands, they're also pretty high on the consensus side. But here's where it gets interesting. Even though both cultures value consensus, they get there in different ways.
Oh, tell me more. How so?
Well, the article talks about how in Japan, consensus is often built like behind the scenes. Lots of one-on-one talks, building relationships, reading between the lines.
Ugh, very subtle. And what about the Netherlands?
They're much more about open debate,
Yeah.
having it all out in the open, even airing disagreements publicly.
Wow, that's quite a contrast. But I guess it shows that there's more than one way to skin a cat, as they say. Though I'm not sure who'd want to do that.
Right. But you see the point. Just knowing a culture values consensus isn't enough. Gotta dig into the how.
Totally agree. That's where the real learning happens. So we've got these two main styles. We've got this map. What about the pros and cons? Which style is better?
That's the million-dollar question. And of course, there's no easy answer. It depends. But the article dives into that, looking at both sides.
Let's start with consensus. What are the upsides?
Well, the big one is buy-in. When everyone feels heard, they're more likely to be on board with the final decision.
Right. Less resistance, more team spirit. And I bet you get more diverse perspectives too, right?
Absolutely. More brains in the game, potentially more creative solutions.
Sounds pretty great so far. But there's got to be a downside, right? Nothing's perfect.
True. The biggie with consensus is it can be slow. Like really slow, especially if you've got a big team with strong opinions.
Oh, yeah. I can see that turning into endless meetings, trying to please everyone. And what if you just can't get everyone to agree?
Deadlock. That's the risk. You can get stuck, unable to move forward. So then you flip over to the top-down style.
Speed and clarity, right. Someone makes the call, everyone knows what they're doing. Especially good in a crisis, I'd imagine.
Exactly. When you need to act fast, top-down can be a lifesaver. But of course, there are trade-offs there too.
Like what? Missing out on valuable input.
Big time. When one person's calling the shots, they might miss crucial information that others have.
And people might resent it too, right? Feeling like their opinions don't matter.
Definitely. That can breed negativity and hurt team morale in the long run. So it's this constant balancing act, figuring out which style is best for the situation, the culture. It's complex.
Super complex. But that's what makes this so interesting. So where do we go from here? How do we actually lead effectively with all this in mind, especially with diverse teams?
That's the million-dollar question, part two. And thankfully, this article gives us some strategies to start with.
All right, let's hear them. We've laid the groundwork. Now give us the tools. Back again, ready to dive deeper into making decisions across cultures. It's a fascinating topic, and we've just scratched the surface.
I'm ready for more. Last time, we were talking about consensus versus top-down, those big cultural differences in how we decide things, plus that culture map to help us navigate.
Right, and you made a great point about communication being key. Now, I want to get into some nitty-gritty tactics, real-world stuff that you can actually use.
Perfect. Let's get tactical.
Yeah.
What's the next level of this decision-making puzzle?
Well, one thing that often trips people up, especially when working with cultures that are more top-down, is the difference between what they call big D decisions and little d decisions.
Okay, I'm intrigued. I haven't heard that before. What's the distinction?
So think big D, as in these are the strategic long-term choices, the ones that have a huge impact, like company mergers, big product launches, the kind of decisions that happen way up top with tons of planning and thought.
Gotcha. Major moves. So little d would be.
More like operational stuff, the day-to-day choices that keep things running smoothly, and they're often more flexible. You can revisit them, tweak them as needed.
So like adjusting a project deadline or what task within a team, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Now, where this gets tricky across cultures is, in some places, especially those top-down ones, once a big D decision is made, it's set in stone. No debate, no going back.
I see where this is going. But in other cultures, maybe even big decisions are seen as more like fluid, open to change.
You got it. And that's where the clash happens. If you have team members with those opposite mindsets, whoa, watch out.
Totally. Imagine someone's used to that flexible approach and suddenly they're told, nope, that decision's made, end of story. They'd be like, wait, what? We can't even talk about it.
Precisely. They might even see it as disrespectful, like their opinion doesn't count. Or, on the flip side, someone from a top-down culture might think all this revisiting is just wasting time.
Great point. It's like one person's being decisive, the other one's being thorough, but they're talking past each other because of this cultural gap. So what's the solution? How do you lead through that mess?
Communication, communication, communication. I know it's the answer to everything, but seriously, you got to be upfront about how decisions are made in your organization and what the expectations are around, changing those decisions.
So like setting ground rules from day one.
Exactly. And not just once, it's an ongoing conversation. Especially as the team faces new challenges, the process might need to adapt too.
Gotcha. It's not set it and forget it. It's keeping that dialogue open the whole time, which probably means a lot of active listening, right? Really trying to understand where people are coming from.
Big time. Especially across cultures, those little nuances in communication can make or break the whole thing.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I bet sometimes it's not even what people are saying, it's what they're not saying. Like someone's culture's big on respecting authority, they might not speak up even if they disagree.
Spot on. So you got to be tuned in, watch for those subtle cues, maybe even gently probe a little deeper to make sure everyone truly feels heard.
That's a real leadership skill, being able to read those signals.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this big D versus little d. We're communicating clearly. What else does the article suggest?
It also highlights how different cultures view leadership itself, which honestly is something I hadn't thought much about before.
Really? How so?
Well, in some cultures, that strong, decisive leader, the one who makes quick, firm decisions, that's seen as super competent, the mark of authority, no hesitation, just action.
Yeah, I can see that, especially in places with a more hierarchical structure. The boss is the boss.
Exactly. But then you've got other cultures where it's much more about collaboration. The leader's more of a facilitator, guiding the group, not dictating.
So it's not just the decision that matters, but how the leader acts while you're getting there. And that can totally change depending on who's in the room.
Absolutely. It all ties back to that chameleon leader idea we talked about. Got to adapt your style to match the cultural context. Sometimes you're leading from the front, sometimes you're blending in. It all depends.
That makes me think of cultural intelligence, that CQ thing we hear about. How does that play into all this?
Oh, CQ is crucial here. It's basically your ability to function well in diverse settings. And when it comes to decisions, it's about being aware of your own biases, understanding others' cultures, and then adjusting your behavior to fit.
So it's not just knowing the facts about a culture. It's actually being able to put that knowledge into action, change how you act.
You got it. And that adaptability, that's what builds trust. People feel like you get them, and then you can make decisions together that everyone's cool with.
Sounds like CQ is a superpower worth developing. So let's shift gears a bit. The article also talks about consensus building, but with that cultural twist.
Yes. Because we often talk about consensus like it's one thing, but how you get there varies wildly.
Oh, I'd love to hear some examples. What are some different ways cultures approach that?
Well, they use Japan again, which makes sense. Their consensus building is often this very indirect thing, lots of behind-the-scenes talks, building relationships, reading those subtle cues we were talking about.
It's like an intricate dance, right?
Yeah.
Way more than just saying what you think.
Totally. And that can be tough for people from cultures that are very direct, where you just say what you mean and move on. They'd be like, why are we beating around the bush?
I can see that.
Yeah.
So if you're leading that kind of mixed group, how do you bridge that gap?
Patience, my friend. Lots of it. And active listening, like we said. Don't rush the process. Don't try to force a decision. Let it unfold naturally. Give people time to get comfortable.
It sounds almost like a meditation practice. Being present, not forcing things. And I bet you got to watch out for those silences. Because in some cultures, silence doesn't mean agreement.
Right. It might mean I'm uncomfortable disagreeing directly, especially if there's a power dynamic at play.
Makes you really consider the weight of each word, each gesture. Okay, so that's Japan. What about some other styles of consensus building?
Well, they contrast that with the Netherlands, where consensus is often built through, get this, open, public debate.
Whoa, that's the opposite end of the spectrum. So in one place, it's all hushed tones, and the other one, it's like a town hall meeting.
You got it. And that just shows even when cultures value the same outcome, consensus, the path to get there can be totally different.
So as a leader, how do you even begin to manage a team with folks from both those backgrounds? Talk about a challenge.
Right. That's where that adaptability comes in big time. You got to know those differences exist. And then be willing to switch up your facilitation style depending on who's in the room.
So sometimes you're guiding a structured discussion, making sure everyone gets their turn to speak, and other times you're stepping back, letting those more informal side conversations happen.
Exactly. And sometimes the best thing you can do is actually talk about those different approaches with the team. Say, hey, we all want to reach consensus, but we might have different ways of getting there. Let's figure out what works for us.
Love that. It's like acknowledging the elephant in the room, that cultural difference, and then using it as a strength. Makes everyone feel seen and respected.
It's all about building that shared understanding, that psychological safety so people feel comfortable speaking up, even if their way of doing things is different. This whole topic reminds me of a story from my own work, actually, working with a global team.
Ooh, a story. I'm
Yeah.
always up for those. What happened?
Yeah.
All right, we're back for the final part of our decision-making journey. This has been a whirlwind of cultural insights, from consensus building to leadership styles, and I feel like we only just scratched the surface.
We have covered a lot of ground. But you're right, there's always more to learn. So far, we've talked about those big cultural differences and how important it is to be flexible and communicate openly. Now let's get into some even more practical day-to-day strategies you can use.
Okay, I'm ready for some action items. What else does this article have up its sleeve?
One thing it really emphasizes is being super mindful of the language you use. Because certain phrases, even if you think they're harmless, can have totally different meanings in other cultures.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, what might sound assertive and direct to you could come across as, like, aggressive or rude to someone else. It's happened to me.
It happens all the time, and it's easy to miss those nuances, especially when you're in the middle of a decision. It can create so much tension without you even realizing it.
So how do we avoid stepping on those cultural landmines?
Well, awareness is key. If you're working with people from different cultures, take the time to learn about their communication styles, what's considered appropriate, what might be sensitive.
Makes sense. Do your homework. And I bet it's helpful to pay attention to how they talk to each other too, right? Like mirror their style a little.
Absolutely. It's that chameleon thing again, adapting to fit in and show respect. And don't be afraid to ask questions. If you're not sure about something, just say, hey, can you help me understand? It's way better than assuming and accidentally offending someone.
So true. Sometimes we get so worried about saying the wrong thing that we end up saying nothing at all. But that can be just as bad, right?
Totally. It's about creating that open, honest communication, even if it feels a little awkward at first. Building that trust is key.
Okay, so language is crucial. What else do we need to be watching for?
Well, in addition to what you say, it's also about how you say it. The article talks a lot about nonverbal cues, like body language and facial expressions. Those can vary wildly across cultures, too.
Oh, I've heard horror stories about that. Someone thinks they're being friendly, but their gestures are totally offensive to someone else. It's wild how much we communicate without even speaking.
It really is. So pay attention. Watch how people from different cultures interact with each other, their tone of voice, their posture, even how much eye contact they make. It all sends a message.
Like you're a cultural detective, piecing together the clues. And I bet it works both ways, right? We got to be mindful of our own body language, too.
For sure. We all have habits, little things we do without thinking. But those habits might not translate well in other cultures. The key is to be self-aware, notice those things, and adjust as needed.
Like, be the most polite, respectful version of yourself, taking those cultural differences into account.
Exactly. Now, beyond all that communication stuff, the article also talks about the importance of finding common ground, especially when you're stuck on a tough decision.
That makes sense. Like, even if you disagree on the how, there's probably some shared goal you can all get behind, right?
Exactly. Maybe everyone wants the project to succeed, or everyone values creating a positive work environment. Highlighting those shared values can really bring people together.
It's a good reminder that you're all on the same team, ultimately.
Exactly. And that can make those tough conversations a lot less stressful. You're all working towards the same thing.
Okay, so we've got communication, common ground. Any other tips before we wrap up?
Yeah, a couple more. The article suggests using visual aids whenever possible, especially if you're dealing with language barriers.
Makes sense. Pictures are worth 1,000 words, as they say.
Right? Things like diagrams, charts, even just simple sketches, they can help get complex ideas across when words fail, or just make sure everyone's literally on the same page.
I'm a visual learner, so that resonates with me. Plus, it's just more inclusive, right? Everyone can participate, even if they're not super confident in their language skills.
Totally. Visuals can also be great for brainstorming, problem solving as a group. Put up a mind map, everyone throws ideas on there. It just makes it easier to collaborate.
Awesome tip. Okay, before we go, any resources you recommend for folks who want to go even deeper on this stuff?
Definitely. We touched on them earlier, but The Culture Map by Erin Meyer is a must-read. It gives you a practical framework for understanding how culture affects everything, from communication to decision-making.
And then there's When Cultures Collide by Richard D. Lewis. That one's been a lifesaver for me. It really digs deep into how our cultural values shape how we see the world.
Two excellent books. I highly recommend both of them. Really opens your eyes to all these nuances we've been talking about.
Awesome. I'll add them to my list. So as we wrap up, I want to circle back to a point the article made that I thought was really powerful. It's the idea that cultural diversity isn't a problem to be solved, but a strength to embrace.
Couldn't agree more. When we approach those differences with curiosity, with a willingness to learn, it opens up so many possibilities. We get new ideas, better solutions. We all grow.
It's like instead of trying to force everyone into the same box, we celebrate those differences.
Yeah.
And ultimately, everyone benefits.
Exactly. And that leads to better decisions, a more positive work environment. It's a win-win all around.
So to everyone listening, be open, be curious, and embrace that richness of different cultures as you make decisions. It's worth it.
And remember, this is a journey. There's no finish line when it comes to understanding other cultures. Just keep learning, keep adapting, and you'll keep growing.
Beautifully said. Thanks so much for joining me on this fascinating deep dive. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine. Until next time, keep exploring and keep making those great decisions.